Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Academy of Insurance Journal's Academy of Insurance webinar after show. I am George Jack. I am normally your host for the webinars that we have every week, and I am your host for this program today. I wanted to say, everybody, thank you for having attended our webinar we just had, a discussion on municipal and law enforcement liability issues. If we do our webinars at night, this would be something where I would say this is a treat you only get in full moons, because today's webinar was a panel discussion, which we don't normally do every week. But for today's panel, we had a couple of Academy instructor regulars, Joe Harrington and Nancy Drummond, and we had a newcomer today, Brennan Quintus. And also helming that discussion was and is our director and my co-host for this segment, Mr. Patrick Great. And want to say hello, Patrick, and ask you how you think the webinar went, and did it pose more questions than it answered about the subject?
Sure. Hey, thanks, George, and thanks for letting me drive that webinar and host that today, and letting you and having you take on the producer role. It helped out a lot,
My pleasure.
I think we had a good time of it. I think we had a great conversation, um, and as often is the case when you have people just talking, it turns up some interesting new questions. I don't know that we solved all the world's issues related to it, but we really did get into some very good conversation. In particular, I thought it was enlightening understanding how a public entity's liability coverage would extend individually to every police officer that is on the police force, and how that affects each individual officer. And interestingly, I discovered that even if there are uncovered losses that aren't covered, that maybe an officer is personally held liable for, oftentimes the municipality will fund that as well. So individually, the liability comes off the individual officers and rests largely with the public entity. And that is part of what I think publicly people think the issue is that officers are not individually held liable sometimes for misconduct or mistakes or errors, or what we would refer to in a professional liability context as errors and omissions. Um, so yeah, I think it answered a lot of questions, brought up a lot of questions too.
Right. I mean, one of the points, one of the umbrellas that kind of got brought up was liability versus responsibility,
Sure.
and that I thought was, you just touched on that, was how what kind of conduct, what kind of behavior is the arresting officer or even the non-arresting officer responsible for, and when does that cross over into liability? And also sovereign immunity versus qualified immunity. That was an interesting
Yeah.
distinction.
Yeah. So in a lot of parts of the country, uh, we have legislatively gotten rid of the idea of sovereign immunities, and in some areas where it's not legislatively taken care of, uh, the existence of insurance has kind of created this idea that a public entity has given up their sovereign immunity because they bought insurance to cover liabilities. Sovereign immunity speaks of an old common law practice, an old common law principle, where the government is immune from being uh, sued or held liable or responsible for the actions that it takes, which takes us back hundreds of years to where where you know if you if you stood against the government or you stood against the king, then the king is sovereign over all and above the law. And we are in a place where we're not looking at anybody as above the law. And that idea of qualified immunity um, gives protection for those employees of governmental entities when when they're acting within the bounds of their job. If they happen to get sued, there's an immunity because they were doing what they ought to be doing. And the problem that's created is the perception that sometimes officers go outside the bounds of what they really should be doing, and they're still being provided this qualified immunity protection, which creates a perception, at the very least, of impropriety.
And the different panelists, I thought, it was a great panel because the different panelists brought in different areas of expertise. And Nancy Drummond is somebody that has done webinars for us relating to hiring insureds and insurance agents and insurance producers, and the struggle with that, and making the industry, engaging young people, and a new crop, a new generation of insurance professionals interested in the industry. So I thought she was uniquely qualified to touch on that, the facet of that when it came to recruiting police officers, and how we need to uh, just do a better job of it,
Mm-hmm.
and how we can, especially in this climate, how we can engage them and have it be something that's a noble pursuit and something worthwhile, especially these days. And she brought up, we need to talk more about, we need to talk these issues through,
Sure.
and things like that. So I didn't know what you thought about that, because I know the Nancy webinars are very interesting, and I wanted to know how you thought her expertise lent itself to the discussion.
Yeah, Nancy has a unique perspective because not only is she an insurance educator, but she's adjunct faculty at a community college, and she's dealing with people, not only a younger generation, but people changing careers. And she's got this perspective of where the culture is from a little bit different standpoint. And she also brought to the table a risk management past with as the first risk management for a particular city in Arizona. And she speaks very well of the not just the struggle to hire, but the struggle to train, and the struggle to hire in a diverse manner, and it is a struggle, not just in the police realm, but in general. There's a struggle in our culture to make our workplace more like the demographic layout of our nation. And she was very eloquent, I think, on some of those issues that came up. I thought it was particularly interesting, her recommendation that more police departments focus on hiring women because of a demonstrated reduction in a tendency to go overboard as far as physical altercations or escalating an incident into a violent, perhaps, moment.
Sure. And she also introduced an acronym that I had not been familiar with, the FTO, the Field Training
Yeah.
Officer. And Joe Harrington had that. I don't know if that made him ask the question, but he introduced the idea, who is liable, because I guess in the George Floyd incident, I'm not sure what else to call it at the moment, so I apologize.
Sure.
But excuse me, he said that a couple of the officers that were present on the scene were trainees, and his question was, that sparked a different uh,
Mhm.
kind of tangent to discussion, is who is liable. Like if the trainees, because they were kind of held back, maybe they were told to hold back by whomever and weren't sure to act. But if they acted, who would be liable then? They themselves, the department, what their training officer,
Yeah.
you know, and
And
go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, it's certainly a complex issue, because it speaks to the culture of a police department. It speaks to the relationship between a trainee and their field training officer. It speaks to a very fluid situation that is very difficult to get all of the information on. Um, and so it really was insightful for him to bring up that thought about dealing with them as they are trainees, and that led to more of a conversation regarding, how do you handle field training officers and trainees. And Nancy made the great point that we need to be very careful who gets to train people.
Absolutely, yeah. And she mentioned bringing retired officers back into coach and or lend their expertise. So I thought that all those points were great. And what did you think of Brennan Quintus's? He was a great contributor as well. I didn't know he had so much expertise in a different facet of that area of the discussion.
Yeah, and so this was kind of a unique session for us in that Joe is a commentator on the insurance industry, and if I give Joe enough time, he can speak eloquently for 45 minutes to an hour on a topic, and can come at it from a research oriented and reasoned place. In fact, Joe brought with him. He's got a family background in public safety as a grandson, I believe he said, of a firefighters and a high-ranking
Yep,
firefighter.
sure.
And Nancy brought with her the background of having that risk management and loss control for the municipality, and in dealing with some of the younger generation from a one-on-one perspective and from a learning and hiring perspective. And then Brennan came to us from an insurance company that handles public entity risk, and even with his underwriting background and now as the CEO of his company, he really added some direct line. Here's what's going on now. Here's what we're seeing from our company's perspective, and it was turned into a very well-rounded conversation, I felt.
Yeah, when the panelists start to ask each other questions, it's going very well. And we got a
Yeah.
lot of great questions from the audience too. So that sort of gets me back to my original thought, which was, did we have more questions than answers, or do you have more? Would you get a lot of your questions answered? Do you have lingering questions yourself about law liability?
I have just kind of scratched the surface myself, and I have now got more questions that I'd like answered, and but I also feel like I have a better understanding as well. And I think that's kind of the point of these conversations is to bring people, add to understanding, and then cause everybody to think and to ask questions themselves.
I'd like to know, as the consistent host of the Academy webinars, would you want to do a sequel to this webinar, and should it be another panel discussion?
Yes and yes.
Okay.
I would love to get um, Brennan on a session by himself to speak from a company perspective about public entity liabilities, just as a webinar that he teaches. I think he would have a great personality for it, and I think he'd be well received.
I agree. And so I wanted to mention that next week's webinar is not going to be a panel discussion, but it's
No.
going to be helmed by you, our director, Patrick Raitt, who is an insured on the CGL, and why do you care? And do you want to talk a moment or two about what next week's webinar is going to entail.
Yeah, sure. On the CGL policy, on the ISO CG 0001, uh, it defines you on the policy as the named insured, and that's, every policy has a you to it. But it also says that there are also other entities that are insured by the policy, not just the named insured. And that can become a complex question, in particular, when you start to deal with different types of business entities, whether they're a sole proprietorship or an LLC, makes a difference who qualifies as an insured. And should there be certain aspects of the organization, perhaps they form an LLC or they form a partnership during the policy period. Does that entity become an insured? And those are the kinds of questions we're looking to deal with.
Fantastic. And that's going to be a week from today at 1:30 p.m., 10:30 Pacific. So do you have any closing remarks before we end our after show?
No, I just thank you for taking the time to do this today, and I hope we can do many more of these.
Absolutely, my pleasure. And so at the end of this segment, you're going to see a link to look into the Academy more. I want to say on behalf of our director, Patrick Great, my name is George. Thanks very much for checking out our after show. And please go to www.iajacademy.com for more information. And thanks very much and have a great Thursday, everybody, and happy 4th of July.
Thanks, George.